I'm Dr. Emily Silverman, and welcome to Talking Dementia with Remo Health. Join us as we explore the latest advances, insights, and strategies that help empower those living with dementia and the families that support them. Each episode, we sit down with leading experts, from physicians and researchers to policymakers and clinicians, to provide you with the resources needed to navigate this complex disease. I'm Dr. Emily Silverman, and you're listening to Remo. Today, we're speaking with Sara Barsel. Sara is a retired research scientist and educator who has been a volunteer dementia advocate for more than 10 years. Sara is the founder and lead for the Dementia-Friendly Airports Working Group and the Roseville Alzheimer's and Dementia Community Action Team, working to improve resources for people living with dementia and their care partners. Sara, thank you so much for coming to Remo today.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
So, Sara, tell us how you got involved with the Dementia-Friendly Airports Working Group.
Okay. I live in Roseville, Minnesota, and in 2013, I started a dementia advocacy group in the city of Roseville. And in 2018, a public health professor who was at a dementia meeting in Australia sent me an email. And the email basically said, "Hey, Sara, I flew into Brisbane Airport and they say they are dementia friendly. What's the status of MSP, which is the local airport for Roseville, Minnesota? And if MSP is not dementia friendly, why doesn't your group make it happen?" So that's how it started. I thought that was a pretty ridiculous response because we have no funding and no way to get any, but I thought, well, it's a good question. And so I got hold of a woman named Maria O'Reilly, who is an occupational therapist in Brisbane. And she was the driving force behind what happened at Brisbane Airport. And I sent her an email and I said, "Hey, Maria, if we want to do this, could we work with you?" And she wrote back and said, "Yes." And then I thought, okay, let me see what our local airport thinks about that. And it turned out that MSP had been running a set of rehearsal trips or desensitization trips for people who had children on the autism spectrum. And that was a monthly trip. They still do it. And you could sign up and go see what was going on in the airport. So I got hold of the woman who was doing that, and I asked her if there would be interest if we tried to set up a comparable trip for people living with dementia or their care partners. And she said yes. And I came back to all the people that I worked with as volunteers, and we said, okay, let's see what we can do. So that's how it got started. There are people in the Roseville Dementia Advocacy Group who are current and former caregivers. There are people who are professional support providers, people in social work and psychology and other things. And so lots of people had heard stories about people doing air travel and having problems. So we knew that anecdotally there were issues. And we decided that that was enough reason to take this request to make MSP dementia friendly, to take that seriously. So that's how it got started.
You mentioned that the airport was already doing rehearsal trips for people with autism. What is a rehearsal trip? I've never heard of that before.
It's basically a chance when you are not booked on a flight to come to the airport and to go behind security. So you get through to the secure side of the airport and to sit on a mock-up for a plane or sit on a real plane. It depends on the airport. To meet people from TSA, to see or do a mock-up of going through security, to find out where the bathrooms are, where the quiet spaces might be, where anything else that you might have need for is, just so that everything becomes familiar.
And when you got this email from Australia, You had already been involved in dementia advocacy, so maybe you can back up a little bit further and tell us, how did you get involved with just dementia as a topic overall?
Okay, when I retired, which was a long time ago, I looked around my community to see what was available for retirees. And I was appalled because basically it was playing cards or bingo or doing something else that was of absolutely no interest to me. And in the course of doing that research, I met a social worker who was a volunteer for the county that I live in, which had an advisory panel to talk to the government about senior services. And so I was invited to participate on that panel. I joined them. And within a year, there was a dementia. Oh, it's Act on Alzheimer's. It was the Minnesota official attempt to involve communities in looking at what their needs might be for people living with dementia in their communities. And so I went to one of their breakout introductory sessions. I came back to my community, which happens to have the largest senior population in the state of Minnesota in a municipality. And so I approached our community government and I said, would you be interested if we had at least an exploratory meeting to see who of the service providers and the service users would be interested in developing some kind of services that are local to the community? And the answer was yes. And the upshot of all of that was that we formed this Roseville Alzheimer and Dementia Community Action Team, which has been going since 2013. And as part of that, I convinced the city of Roseville to support a web page on their official website. And the web page is devoted to dementia resources. So support groups and services, activities, webinars and information, anything else we could find. And it's updated every month. And that's been running since 2014. As far as we know, it's the only municipality in the country that actually has some formal support for the population living with dementia or the care partners on its website. So that's where that all came from.
Back to the topic of travel.
Sure.
So let's say I'm in a family, there's someone in the family who is living with dementia, and we are trying to figure out if that family member is fit to travel. Here at Remo, we talk a lot about the stages of dementia. So everything from mild cognitive impairment, you may not even know there's anything going on, to obviously the very late stages of dementia, end of life care, people who are bedbound and needing help with everything. Just a huge spectrum of severity of disease. But there's that muddy middle where, you might not be sure if someone is able to travel alone or if someone is able to travel at all. So how do you think about giving advice to families? How can they think about whether their loved one is able to travel and so on?
So the question is whether Aunt Betty should travel by herself if you just put her on an airplane and give her a ticket is a separate question from whether or not anybody should be traveling or is able to travel. So there are several things that are involved with travel. One of them is, if you think about airports are three-ring circuses, and they're challenging to anybody. And most of the time, some part of the airport is under construction, and it's noisy, and it's crowded, and God help us, TSA is telling us how many people there are going to be Thanksgiving weekend or whatever it is. So it's a fraught situation for anyone. So you want to think about what are the capacities of the person who is living with dementia who you're hoping can travel? And what are the reasons for the travel? So you need to know, is it somebody who's subject to sundowning or somebody who is prone to elope or who has other physical restrictions that really complicate things? So there are all kinds of details that you need about your particular loved one But once you have that, then it's important to think about what are the abilities that you need, that anybody needs to function in the airport. So you need cognitive abilities. You need to be able to think, to improvise, and to problem solve. You need physical abilities because even the smallest airports are physically large. So you have to be able to get from one end of the airport to the other. You may have to change levels by using staircases or elevator, whatever is available. And so you have to have functional mobility. You have to have functional hearing and functional vision. You need some kind of grip strength because you're most likely carrying something onto the airplane with you, and you have your luggage that you have to get to baggage claim or all those pieces. So you need to think about what are those requirements. Also, whether or not the person that you're concerned about can maintain civility when they're interacting with staff. Can they maintain social norms? And that got really complicated during COVID because then everybody was supposed to be masked, which really made it difficult. But now we're kind of in between with that. And then also, does somebody have bladder and bowel control? Are they incontinent? So you have all of those things to think about. And then what's important is to think about how does the symptom or group of symptoms or whatever you're concerned about manifest itself in the individual that you're working with. So we have somebody in our group who's an advanced practice nurse who specializes in dementia, and she took the Alzheimer's Association list of the 10 signs, the 10 warning signs for dementia. And she tried to describe how each sign would manifest itself in an airport situation. So that's on our website. Anybody can read it. I'm not going to read it to you. But what it comes down to is what are the behaviors that you might have to deal with? And then what are your skills in terms of either bringing the person and diverting their attention or redirecting them? Or do you have materials that will calm them down? Do they have headphones that you can put on? Are they noise canceling? Do they have sounds that they like? Do you have some kind of mechanical pet that's soothing if they bring it? Do you have a weighted blanket? Favorite snacks? You need to think about all of those things and whether or not you yourself have the strength and ability to manage what your companion needs and to take care of yourself, again, in an airport situation, which is not going to be easy to navigate even when everybody's in terrific shape. So you think about that. But then the other thing people need to know is that there are lots of supports available. TSA keeps increasing the supports available. So there's something called TSA Cares, which is a helpline, and anybody can dial it up and they'll talk to you. And it provides detailed information in response to your questions about how to get through security. What are the issues that you might be faced with? The other thing TSA Cares can be used for is to inform them that you want to have a personal support specialist, which is a TSA Cares agent who has been specially trained in how to deal with people with who knows what hidden disabilities. Okay. It may or may not be the one hidden disability that you happen to be dealing with, but they've had some special training. So you can request to have a passenger support specialist who will assist you going through security when you actually are at the airport. So people need to know that they can do that. The airports on their websites have information about accessibility services. And that's normally how it's listed. So if you look at the title on whatever the website is, you can find it. And that will give you details about things like using wheelchairs. The way to use a wheelchair in the terminal is that you have to request it in advance from your airline. Very seldom do airports just happen to have wheelchairs sitting around or any wheelchair operators who can take you someplace. So you need to know to do that. And again, a lot of these have 72-hour advance notice requirements, things like that. But with the airlines and the airports, when you're thinking about booking your trip, that's when you should start talking to them about it. So airlines also have special services, and they will tell you right up front on their websites what they can and cannot do for somebody who is in flight as a passenger. For instance, they can help you open the little containers that pass for food on the flight, but they cannot help you eat it. If they have an inboard or an in-flight wheelchair, they may be able to help you get into the wheelchair and take you down the aisle to where the bathroom is, but they cannot help you use the bathroom. So you need, again, to think about what are the physical abilities and needs of the individual who has dementia whom you are traveling with. Now, a positive thing that's available, there are people who are professional travel companions, and you can hire someone. We have some people in our group who have some training in dementia, and you hire them and they will book your flight and make all the arrangements and then pick you up and go with you to wherever your destination is. And it can be across the world. It's this one gal's done 130 something trips. She goes all over, but they will take responsibility for you. The other thing that you can do, and there are now over 240 airports in the world, about 70 in the US, who participate in the Hidden Disabilities Sunflower program. And that is a lanyard program. You get a free lanyard from a participating airport. And if you wear it, what it indicates is I have a hidden disability. I don't have to tell you anything about what it is. But if you see me wearing this sunflower lanyard, please be a little more patient. Give me a little more time for whatever is happening. Be civil. And it's a very, very successful program. It started in 2016 at Gatwick Airport. They had a lot of people coming through the airport because there was a Paralympics going on. And they wanted to be able to assist people and be respectful of who they were and what their needs were. And they didn't want to have to ask everybody any invasive questions. So that sunflower lanyard has now traveled all over the world. And we're really happy to see it and see it expand. So again, you can find out from the accessibility page of your airports whether or not they are participants in the Sunflower Lanyard program. And then if they are, you can ask them to provide you with a free lanyard. And they train their staff. So staff knows to recognize this.
You mentioned that there are a lot of different invisible disabilities that people deal with who are traveling, and that can be hearing loss, that can be autism, that can be any number of things. How do you think about dementia travelers? Do they have a lot of unique needs that are separate from other invisible disabilities, or do you feel like there's a lot of overlap with some of these other disabilities, and actually just designing a program that's maybe not dementia specific, but just disability specific is enough? Or how do you think about teasing out dementia as its own separate process?
Well, you know, as a practitioner, that there are many types of dementia. And depending on which type and at what stage you encounter somebody, you're going to have a whole different raft of behaviors and capacities to deal with. And you also know that primarily seniors are the people who are impacted, not exclusively. So, in addition to having dementia, many people will have impaired mobility, hearing, vision, you name it, right? Those are going to be requiring different accommodations than somebody whose child is on the autism spectrum who may need to fidget or need to have some sensory adaptations. And the same thing for people who are deaf and hard of hearing and people who have COPD and people who have PTSD. I mean, there are so many different hidden disabilities. And the complication in the airports is that, first of all, airports are they're highly functional businesses. And the cost of space in an airport is essentially a main characteristic of whether or not something gets modified to accommodate a population. So, what's happening right now is that on the autism spectrum, there are lots of parents, and some of them have money. And so they're able to go to their local airports and they're able to help fund the establishment of sensory rooms. And I'm seeing these being developed all over. When I sit in some of the airport discussions, people are trying to figure out whether or not those sensory rooms can simultaneously serve the needs of people with dementia. Now, think about it. If you have a child who's very active or very involved in physically moving around someplace or needs a certain construction of sight and sound and possibly temperature and such and other textures, how is that going to be compatible with somebody who's living with dementia who also wants to use the same space and maybe just needs to sit still or maybe needs other things to comfort them? Sometimes it will be compatible and sometimes it will be contrary. And that's a serious problem. So we've been talking with an assortment of airports who are trying to figure out what to do about the competition for a limited amount of space and the money it takes to address whatever that issue is. So, when you ask if there are homogeneous or uniform ways to address people with hidden disabilities, I think the answer is no. It would be nice, but it's not there. But there are some things that do overlap. For instance, when we talk about modifications that or ways to interact with people showing some of these behaviors that are technically symptoms of certain dementia, the ways that we're suggesting to staff to interact are ways that are respectful and will work very well with somebody who doesn't have any hidden disability, with somebody who has a hearing loss, with somebody with some other problem. So there's no one size fits all.
Tell us about this survey that happened in 2019, which identified a very critical need among staff. What was the finding and what was the revelation there?
So when we started in 2019, the only survey information about how people with dementia were surviving their air travel experiences came from our contact in Australia, and it only had about 20 respondents. So we thought that was nice, but it was not sufficient for us to work with. And so we constructed a survey. We went through the IRB at the University of Minnesota and made it a fancy survey. And the upshot was that we asked people to tell us or to answer questions about their travel experiences any place. And we asked them, are you a person living with dementia or MCI? Or are you a travel companion, a PCA, a caregiver? Just identify the class that you would fall into. And we looked at the answers and we found that we had some primary results. First of all, anxiety was the biggest thing to jump out. And people were anxious about getting through security. And this was in the US. And they were anxious about the general airport experience because navigating the airport, understanding the signs and the announcements was really difficult. And if you think about it, it's difficult for anyone. I mean, It's like listening to an echo chamber try to tell you something, and it just doesn't work very well. So the other concern that people had, especially for the dementia community, was getting lost or separated from their care partner or travel companion. And that is actually a matter of life and death, because once in a while, you'll see in some newspaper a story about someone who got lost in the airport, wound up outside the airport. They couldn't find them, and they find their body it's just an absolute nightmare. So nobody wants anything like that to happen. And if you think about symptoms of dementia, one of them is the difficulty in communication. You cannot articulate or understand or retain instructions. So if you get lost in the airport, how do you tell somebody that you're lost? This survey predated the prevalence of smartwatches and everybody having an iPhone, and ways that we can communicate now that were not available to everybody in 2019. So that's part of why this came out. Another thing that came out in the survey was that people had difficulty finding family restrooms and quiet spaces. And the family restrooms are important because, again, if you've got somebody who's of a different gender and who has incontinence or some other problem, how are you going to help them get clean? Now, since that survey, MSP and a handful of other airports in the US have started installing family restrooms with changing tables. And so there might be 2 or 3 in an airport. That doesn't mean it's close to where your gate is or anything else. So being available or listed on the list of what services do we have doesn't necessarily mean that you can get to it and use it in time, but at least the idea is there. The other thing is that many people who filled out our survey were unaware of any services that are available to travelers. So they didn't know that airports have websites with accessibility services. They did not know that airlines have websites with accessibility services. And when you book your flight on an airline, you need to insist that they put special service codes in that identify who you are, what type of services you need, and such. So people didn't know anything about this. And then people on the survey also recommended that the staff in the airports and the airlines have some kind of training so they could interact in a more productive way, friendly way, less difficult way with people who were demonstrating behaviors that were not necessarily familiar to whoever the staff member was. So they wouldn't be abrupt, they wouldn't be rude. So we looked at all of that, and that's what came out of the survey. Now, you asked me another part of the question, I've forgotten completely what it was.
Well, we spoke to a caregiver here at Remo who told a story about being in an airport with her husband, and, he had behavioral issues related to his dementia and was being disruptive in the airport, was shouting about something. And of course, she was mortified. She looked around. She was sort of looking apologetically at everybody else. And she said that the other passengers and people in the airport were really understanding and kind and treated her with grace. But I imagine that that's not always the case, especially if people don't understand that this is a person living with dementia. This isn't just a person who's choosing to behave in this way necessarily.
Yes.
So maybe you can talk about the interpersonal aspect of like staff training and like de-escalation techniques, or even just stuff you said about being civil. It's one thing to have objects like weighted blankets and robot support animals and those sorts of things, but these more soft skills related to interpersonal relationships, can you talk about that?
Not very much, because you have to realize that the time allotted for training staff is very, very little. And there is no requirement to train your staff. It's not required to be badged in order to be able to be employed in the front of the airport, no matter what your position is. Plus, depending on what job you have, if you're in retail versus some front end of the airline versus some front end of the airport or a volunteer, there's staff turnover. And so all of that complicates everything. The best that we were able to do was to work with Teepa Snow, whom you may know, and who is basically a rock star of dementia caregiving protocols.
Who is that?
Teepa Snow, Teepa Snow. She's based in North Carolina. She has a business called Positive Approach to Care. She's been around for years. She is an internationally known occupational therapist who does dementia training. So some of our members are trained by Teepa, and we wrote 3 to 4 minute scenarios based on actions that would fall apart in an airport, interactions between somebody living with dementia and some airport staff or operation that had to be acted out. And we asked if Teepa would record these, and she wound up making these short videos for us. And again, they're on our website. Anybody can access them. And so they demonstrate a few things. One of them, for instance, if somebody goes to use some of the new technology, if you're trying to use any of the electronic check-in mechanisms, that's confusing to people. And if you have dementia, it's really more confusing. So she's got a little episode where she shows that. She's got an episode where she shows somebody trying to select which type of water to purchase in a store in the airport. There are too many selections. There are too many types and sizes and everything. So she has demonstrated how the retail staff could simplify that selection by saying, well, here are 2 different types you can choose from. This is why, this is how, and then assisting in that procedure. She demonstrates how to interact with somebody who's having a visual hallucination in the airport and how to assure them that you're going to take care of it. It's fine. Let me help you continue where you're supposed to be going, this kind of thing. So we chose 9 different activities or actions, but that's about as good as it gets. We don't have any funding. You could make an entire encyclopedia of very short videos demonstrating how to interact in a more positive way. But that's about the best we can do. The other thing we just do is we have an e-learning, and then we have a live workshop version of it where 2 of our members who like to be very dramatic will act out. They're taking the role of somebody in a certain situation, and they demonstrate how staff might deal with them to resolve whatever the problem is. And that's the best we can do. We have very limited support for the tools. We're working as hard as possible to get airports to adopt them. They are adaptable tools too. They can be customized, but they've just become available. So it's a very difficult situation. And yes, there are times where somebody will have some set of behaviors, and the only thing that can be done is to call airport security to try and have them secure or isolate or remove the individual having the difficulty. We don't have any magic for that.
You mentioned that there isn't much funding or much known about how best to handle these situations or research into this topic. And it seems like if we were able to put some funding and time and effort and thought into these situations, more and more people are going to be aging and getting dementia, that it wouldn't only be helpful for airports, but could be helpful just for society in general. People with dementia are going to be inside of airports. They're also going to be inside of restaurants. They're also going to be, at the gas station and all sorts of different places. And, in my mind, sometimes I imagine 20, 50 years down the line, like what would it look like to have a more dementia-friendly or dementia-literate or dementia-aware society where you go to the bookstore or the library or the gas station and it's more built into the overall environment, this, I guess, sensitivity to the needs of people with dementia. Do you see things moving more in that direction as the population ages and dementia becomes so much more common?
Not in the US at the moment. It is more the case if you're in the UK, and there are some interesting things happening in Australia, but I don't see them happening in the US. And it's not for lack of talking about it. One thing to recognize is that we have different funding and mechanisms for our healthcare systems. So, what can be treated or addressed in the US is very different than the way it's handled in countries in the UK or anyplace else. That makes a difference. Regulations, again, back to air travel. The regulations for airlines and airports and security are very different in the UK than they are in the US.
How so?
Oh, well, that's like a 45-minute dissertation. I don't think you want to go there.
Okay.
Yeah, but the bottom line is that the UK has the Civil Aviation Authority, which regulates both the airports and the airlines and can control what is done in terms of training. And it's very, very different than what happens in the US, where the airlines are separately regulated from the airports. And then you have TSA, which is part of Homeland Security, and everybody's separate and not always cooperative. That's the very, very short answer.
Well, what would you wish to see if someone wrote you a check for $1 billion and said, use this money to create a more dementia-friendly society? And that includes airports, but it also includes, like I said, restaurants, libraries, gas stations, things like that. Like obviously that's a very big question, but just off the cuff, I'm wondering what would be on your wish list?
Well, I haven't gotten to visit them, but there are some residential villages in the Netherlands where people living with dementia and caretakers, professional caretakers, live in the same community, and it's a walled community. So you can move around with freedom within the community, but you cannot leave it. And some of those sound to me like they are empowering the people living with dementia at different stages in their disease to be able to express themselves and enjoy interaction with other people and with the staff, because at least the descriptions make it sound like they're physically responsible for housekeeping and meal provision and taking care of the gardens and a whole bunch of things that you would normally do if you were living in a normal residence. So I look at that and I think that's a wonderful idea. Can we explore something like that, as opposed to what I see primarily, and this is not my field, so it's a very limited vision, but what I see in the independent living spectrum all the way through dementia care housing silos that are being built through the US in our communities, where people mean well, but first of all, they're understaffed. And I'm not sure that they're really trying to empower or that they're able to, because of the staffing issues, both training and numbers, to empower the people living with dementia to do much beyond physically be present. Now, one of our members had been in charge of a dementia unit for a long time. And it was a residential unit. And that particular facility has a day trip program. Once a week, they load whomever it is on the bus and they go off on a day trip to, the zoo or the aquarium or whatever it happens to be, that has been checked out previously by staff to make sure that they can accommodate them in terms of bathroom needs and wheelchairs and anything else that people need. I think that's a wonderful idea. I don't think it's a very common one, but that's once a day or, once a week for part of a day. And then what do you do the rest of the time? It's very complicated. And then again, if you have Lewy body dementia, you're going to have completely different needs than somebody who is living with Alzheimer's in whatever stage, than somebody who has FTD, than somebody who has vascular dementia. So just with those four major types, how do you have anything that's uniform? And what we do right now is to say, oh, well, if you've got any of the above, here we're going to put you in the same circumstance. And that to me is horrific and terrifying, but it may be the only thing available at the moment. And we don't think creatively about healthcare in this country. So I think that that's part of what's underlying it. And as a former special ed teacher, I can tell you that we don't think creatively or civilly about how to interact with anybody who doesn't meet our image of what should be for fill in the blank. So we have images of how children are supposed to look and behave. And we have images in our head based on whatever entertainment of how everybody else is supposed to look and behave. And it's changed. I mean, I'm 76, so I've seen lots of changes in what the images are, but it still comes down to a restrictive framework. And we're not willing to say, oh, but anybody outside that framework still has enormous value. They can make a contribution. They can enjoy something. Maybe somebody who's living with Down syndrome in a very extreme form cannot demonstrate that they appreciate the music from a concert the way somebody else who can dance and perform and jump around is, but it doesn't mean that they don't appreciate it. But we don't, as a society, we don't accept that or acknowledge it or do anything with it. So I think when you come back to the question about what happens as we have this increasing population of people with any type of dementia or any other type of disability, I think the answer is we've cooked our own goose. And unless we really start to think about how individuals are valuable and don't have to be rubber stamps of each other, we're not going to get very far. And it's terrifying. That's the other thing. And when you look at, the Hollywood portrayal, okay, so we've gone through now, I don't watch very much TV, but I do see movies. And occasionally, there have been movies and it's been so-and-so who is disintegrating. So you find Meryl Streep and she can't find the bathroom anymore or some, other things like this. No, that was one of them a long time ago. Anyway, the bottom line is you watch that and the message out of it is that everybody is terrified. If the person experiencing it is aware of it, they are terrified. And anybody around them is uncomfortable and terrified, and there's still a stigma. You're not allowed to talk about it. So how do we get beyond that?
I love what you said about in this country, we could be so much more creative about healthcare. And I do think there's a lot about American healthcare that's completely dysfunctional. And there's also a lot of creativity in the American people, a spirit of innovation in the American people. And maybe there are ways we can unleash some of that creativity in these spaces when it comes to, how do we either integrate people with dementia into broader society, or like you said, create these havens or these special spaces like the villages in the Netherlands that are specifically tailored and designed to empower and nourish and support that community. I mean, maybe it's something like a special terminal at an airport where instead of having to, shepherd somebody through the normal chaotic terminal, maybe there's, a special terminal that's built for people who have sensitivities. And I don't know, maybe that's an idea.
Well, I'll tell you, again, back to the UK. And once in a while, I'll hear about some US airport that's done that, where they will have at least a special security screening line. So people, and you refer yourself into it. It's not that they come along and say, you, not you, anything like that. So if you have a mobility issue, if you have a hidden disability, if you have a stroller, if you have anything that's going to require more time and attention as you go through the security screening wherever you happen to be, then you can self-direct yourself into this alternative line for screening. And they have that at Heathrow, and they have that at Gatwick, and they probably have it at many of the other UK airports. I don't keep a daily tab on any of that. I know that I was told that New Orleans Airport had a stroller lane, and that they also welcomed people who were wearing the Hidden Disabilities Sunflower lanyard into that lane. Now, I've brought it up to TSA, and TSA can't control how many lanes and where they are because the airports control it, and then actually the airlines control it depending on who's the dominant airline in your airport. So again, this is where it gets complicated, and it's different than it is in the UK, and it's even different. Missoula, Montana is one of the airports that's been working with our group, and they are wonderful. And they have a small airport because it's Missoula, it's not JFK. And the personnel who work the airport are all Missoula County employees, as opposed to in the big airports where they are employees specific to an airline or the airport or the municipality. So in Missoula, they can determine who gets what training and how you complete it, how many times you have to go through it, what you have to do to demonstrate that you have some qualification after you've finished the training. I mean, remember that we can set up training, and if we don't have any evaluative component, so what, right? So it's interesting that way. But again, it sits there, and I've just lost my thought. So
No.
sorry. It's
any parting thoughts? So for people listening, people and families living with dementia, any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave them with?
There is a wonderful book, and it's written by this advanced practice nurse in dementia, and it's called Travel Well with Dementia. And it's by a woman named Jan Dougherty, Dougherty. You can buy it online. We have links to it. And she has just a wealth of excellent ideas for how people traveling with dementia, people living with dementia, can progress and have a successful trip. And then if people look on our website, we have some of these little films by Teepa Snow. We have information about how to get through the airport and how to get through booking your flight all the way through getting your baggage and such. We have broken it down as carefully as possible, and we have links that we hope are always functional so that it provides the maximum amount of suggestion to people who are trying to deal with this. And it's a complicated problem, but people with dementia travel not just because they have to, they travel for vacations, and they travel for family events, and they travel to relocate. And, people have bucket lists. So there's no reason not to try it, but you have to be, it's almost an oxymoron. You have to be self-aware in order to travel well with dementia. So your care partner and the people with you, and you have to have realistic expectations. I think that's part of it too. But we've got suggestions about all of that. So I hope that people will take that as an opportunity to expand what they can do with their lives while they're able to, because that's really important.
I think that's a wonderful place to end. So if you're listening to this, maybe this will inspire you to take that trip or tick that item off your bucket list or go to that family event. There's a lot of anxiety around travel, but there's a lot of resources available, more than I even realized. I've learned so much in this conversation, Sara, and I know there's a wealth of resources online, like you said, that people can tap into as they're planning their travel. So thank you, Sara, so much for speaking with Remo today. We're really grateful for all your contributions.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to Talking Dementia with Remo Health. If you're looking for more information, resources, and expert insights, visit remo.health and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, take care.